Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today, we're diving into one of the most comforting but also one of the most hotly debated ideas in all of Christianity. Once saved, always saved. For millions, it's a source of incredible peace. But is it the whole story? Let's get into it.
You can see the appeal right away. At its core, this doctrine offers a kind of ultimate spiritual safety net. The idea is that once you're truly saved, that's it. Your salvation is secure, kept for you, no matter what you do or how you fail in the future. The source material we're looking at puts it in this really powerful way. Your ticket to heaven is punched and non-refundable. That paints a picture of a finished transaction, doesn't it? A gift of grace so absolute that once God gives it, He can never ever take it back.
But here's where things get complicated. What if that comforting promise is actually based on a dangerous misreading of the Bible? What if, as our source argues, it actually puts people at risk by giving them a false sense of security?
Sometimes the best way to get a handle on these big theological ideas is to look at a real person's life. So, to understand this debate, we're not going to start with theology. We're going to start with the unsettling story of a man named Charles Templeton.
Back in the 1940s, Charles Templeton was an absolute superstar. I mean, a lot of people thought he had even more potential than his friend Billy Graham. He preached to massive crowds, and by all accounts, his ministry was incredibly fruitful. But then, it all began to unravel. He was swamped with doubts, left the ministry, and in 1995 he published a book called Farewell to God. He died an agnostic.
So, Templeton's story just forces us to ask this huge question. If salvation is a one-time, unbreakable deal, what on earth do we do with a story like his?
Okay, so the standard answer you'll hear from supporters of eternal security is, well, he must have never been truly saved in the first place. But the source points out that this just opens up a whole new can of worms. It creates this agonizing fear. Because if a guy who seemed to have more evidence of salvation than almost anyone wasn't actually saved, how can any of us, with all our own doubts and struggles, ever be sure that our conversion was the real deal?
And Templeton's story throws us right into the middle of a debate that's been raging in the church for centuries. It really boils down to two completely different ways of looking at how salvation works.
So, on one side you have the perseverance of the saints, which is usually associated with Calvinism. This view says that God's power is so absolute that He preserves every single person who is truly saved. So, if someone seems to fall away, it's proof they were never a genuine believer to begin with. Then, on the other side, you have conditional security, linked to Arminianism. This view says that because faith is a free will choice, a genuine believer has to have the freedom to later choose to reject that faith and walk away. One view emphasizes God's sovereign power to keep His people, while the other emphasizes the need for human free will for a relationship to be real.
Now, you would think, right, if it was actually possible for a true believer to lose their salvation, the Bible would have to warn us about it. Well, the argument is that it does, and not just in a few vague verses, but in entire passages that are screaming at believers to persevere.
Let's start with what our source calls maybe the single toughest passage for the eternal security position. It's from the book of Hebrews, chapter 6. The author is describing people who've had these incredibly deep spiritual experiences, and then says it's possible for them to fall away.
I mean, just look at the language used here. These are people who have been enlightened, who have tasted the heavenly gift, and, get this, have shared in the Holy Spirit. The argument is pretty simple. If that language doesn't describe a real Christian, then what language possibly could?
And then we can jump over to Galatians. The Apostle Paul warns believers, actual believers, that by turning back to the old law, they can be severed from Christ and have fallen away from grace. The logic here is just so powerful and straightforward. You cannot fall from a place you have never been standing. To fall from grace, you had to have been in grace.
Okay, and this proverb from 2 Peter paints it's a pretty graphic picture, but it makes an unforgettable point. Peter's talking about people who knew Christ but got tangled up in the world again. And the key detail in that proverb, the sow was genuinely washed. The cleaning was real, but she chose to go back to the mud, which makes her final situation even worse than before she was clean.
All right, so we've seen the warnings, but what about all those incredible promises of security that the once saved, always saved position is built on? Well, the key here is to look really closely at the context. Are they the ironclad, no-strings-attached guarantee that many people think they are?
This right here is probably the most famous one. Jesus says of His sheep, "No one will snatch them out of my hand." And it's an absolutely beautiful, powerful, and true promise of God's incredible keeping power.
But here's the counterinterpretation. Notice who the promise is for. It's for my sheep. And how does Jesus define his sheep? As those who hear my voice and follow me. So the security is from outside forces. No person, no demon, no power can rip you away from God against your will. But it doesn't seem to address the possibility that one of the sheep could just decide to stop following, to willfully walk away on its own.
And you see a very similar thing over in Romans chapter 8. Paul gives this glorious, soaring list of all the cosmic powers that could never separate us from God's love. It's amazing. But again, the source points out what's missing from that list of external threats, the one internal factor of a person's own free will to just walk away.
So look, this isn't just about winning a theological debate. The argument is that this doctrine can have some really dangerous real-world consequences. For some, it can become a license to sin, a get-out-of-jail-free card. For others, ironically, it creates that constant agonizing fear that maybe their conversion wasn't real enough. And ultimately, it can cause us to soften or explain away all those urgent warnings we just looked at in the Bible.
So if once saved, always saved might be a misunderstanding, what's the alternative? Does that just mean living a life of constant insecurity and fear? Not at all. The source argues the alternative is a call to a faith that is living, that is real, and that endures.
You know that verse in Philippians where Paul says to work out your own salvation with fear and trembling? That can sound kind of scary, like you have to earn it. But the source stresses that's not what it means. It's not working for salvation, it's about working out what God has already worked in you. It's about stewarding this incredible gift with a sense of awe, respect, and yeah, a healthy understanding that drifting away is a real danger.
And this really gets to the heart of what true biblical assurance looks like, according to the source. It's not found by looking back at a single, static transaction in the past. It's a dynamic, daily confidence that you find in an ongoing, present-tense relationship with God. It's the assurance that as you hold on to Him, He promises He will always, always hold on to you.
And that leaves us with this final, critical question. Where does real, lasting assurance actually come from? Is it found in clinging to a doctrine about a past event? Or is it found in clinging to the person of Christ in a living, breathing, present relationship? It's a question that challenges us to move beyond a legal status and into a daily walk of faith.